I've been talking to Kevin Birn, the economist who is the vice president of Canadian oil markets and chief analyst for S&P Global Commodity Insights, about GHG emissions from the Alberta oil sands for quite a while now, probably at least 5 or 6 years. The annual report on oil sands emissions has come out, and for the first time, emissions held steady, even though production went up. And historically, that has not been the case. The emissions intensity per barrel has been coming down over the last 10 or 15 years, but the increased production has overwhelmed that. And so the absolute emissions have always been rising. Now they stand at about 81 megatons per year. And I'm going to talk to Kevin about the implications of that, what's causing it. And I also wanted to, we'll be asking him some questions, and this is why you might want to pay particular attention to this interview, about the emerging interest on the global level in pricing emissions intensity in oil and gas. So welcome to the interview, Kevin.
It's good to be here.
Well, good to see you again. So give us an overview of the study that you released a day or two ago.
Sure. So I think it's for the last couple of years, we've been producing an annual look back at oil sands emission intensity. And we've also been publishing in more recent editions, absolute emissions, so how we see them change. And I want to be very clear when we show these numbers and we publish them, and you and I have talked about this many times, Markham, what is in an emission really matters. And what is it we're talking about? So in the absolute emission category, we are generating an emission estimate on scope 1 emissions, so only direct emissions associated with these operations. And this is for alignment with Canada's national inventory, which follows a similar process, with two exceptions, and that is footnoted clearly in the release. We don't consider the emissions associated with a refinery that the CCC considers part of that right now, as well as the upgrader in Lloydminster, which processes both a mixture of some oil sands, but also some non-oil sands. We don't include that, and that results in a delta of about 3 megatons. The emission intensity numbers are a marketable product. So this isn't the emission intensity of the operation only. This is what they would put into the market. So it includes the emission intensities of the diluents they use, for example, that are blended in. So I just want to be really clear with that. The study this year found that the emission intensity of oil sands continued its long trend, falling on average at about 1.5 kilograms per year, year-on-year change. And it averaged just around 66.5 kilograms, you round up to 67 in the whole sector. The absolute emissions, though, for us, this is not something we anticipated to see, were roughly flat compared to the prior year of 2021. So it's 2022 versus 2021. And this is the only time in our study's history that oil sands emissions did not grow, absent of a major market disruption which caused production to drop.
Now, last year, oil sands production topped out at 3.1 million barrels a day. So that's a new record for the sector. It gained 50,000 barrels a day of new production. And the emissions intensity per barrel is now at 67 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. That's down, if I remember correctly, from 68 or 69 when we talked last year. So what's causing the drop in the emissions intensity? What has changed since last year?
Well, it's part of a long-term trend of operational improvements. So they are effectively using the fuels they've been using traditionally to either increase the amount of units they can put out the door, because you got to remember this is an emission intensity number, is your total emissions divided by your output. So you can drop that number by increasing your output, but not increasing your emissions. And so certainly that's been something we've seen. Higher utilization rates, less downtime, means they're using the energy that they've been using traditionally more efficiently per unit. And so that contributed. But we've also seen improvements in terms of the overall energy they're using as well falling. So some reductions in petroleum coke use, for example, those sorts of changes. Taken together, that contributes to reduction. The other thing that's really important is the oil sands is far from homogeneous. And if you look at our posting, it comes in an incredible variation of emissions. And why I'm raising this is because it really matters what's growing. If you think about a weighted average, if your growth is from the lower and less intensive, so it'd be below average, the more volume you get from that side will tilt and skew the overall average towards that end versus being higher carbon growing right? And so that's also contributed. So we've seen growth from relatively less carbon intensity or below the industry average carbon intensity, which has helped pull that intensity down and contributed to those year-on-year changes that we've seen historically.
Have we seen any improvements in the intensity in the crude that is considered high emissions intensity? And I'm thinking here of mine synthetic crude and also the combined steam stimulation, cyclical steam stimulation. Those have generally very, very high emissions intensity. Are we seeing any improvement there?
So the cyclic steam stimulation, which for your listeners is the vertical well injection and then recovery. So they use a singular well, they inject and create a spherical steam chamber. So it is what it sounds like. It's a sphere. And then they let that steam soak and let the bitumen be doing energy transfer, mobilize, and then they recover up through that well. That's increased roughly since about 2014. It's been on an upward trend. It did decline modestly in 2022 versus 2021, but it's about 13% higher than it was when we started doing the studies back in 2009. And this could be the fact that there's not a lot of resource that is thick enough to build those steam chambers and the maturity of the resource. And even in those regions and areas where they would have traditionally done cyclic steam, we're seeing a lot more SAGD. So you could have a dilution effective preference for SAGD going on there as well. On the mining side, which is the other one, if you look at our graph, is above the industry average. Two important points. So first, the historical or legacy mining project actually produced a synthetic crude oil, not a dilbit. And so they're processing or partially processing these barrels up in Fort McMurray area, which adds to the overall carbon intensity profile in the upstream. Consequently, when you were to refine them, they'd be less carbon intensive to refine versus the dilbits being produced in the oil sands. That has been the single largest source, or I shouldn't say that way, that segment has seen the largest emission intensity reductions over time compared to any other segment. It's fallen about 28% since 2009, or about 33 kilograms per barrel to average about 86. And it ranged from about a 70 to 120 kilograms of segment as well. So it's seen some remarkable changes overall. And that's been a major driver of the overall intensity reduction as well. That segment seeing significant reductions. Meanwhile, the other thing, of course, is always volume. There's been a huge amount of growth in the SAGD category, which is less than the industry average, diluting and pulling down. Those two factors we think has contributed to the bulk of those intensity improvements over time.
Now, mostly what we're talking about, if I understand this correctly, is improvements in efficiency, using steam more efficiently, that sort of thing. What about some of the technologies that the industry has developed specifically to reduce emissions intensity? And I'm thinking here as an example of solvent substitution or solvent, not just substitution, but solvent addition to steam or completely substituting solvent for steam. Are any of those technologies having any kind of an effect on emissions intensity?
It's hard for us to parse out those types of details, but I will give you a little bit of like we classify that category of technologies, which include methane co-injection for us. We call them steam displacement technologies, and we call them that because that is what they're doing, right? So the purpose of the steam being injected in the reservoirs has two functions. The first one, it creates pressure. You're pushing and mobilizing that bitumen to the recovery well, which sits below the injection well. The second one is energy transfer. So you're transferring the heat from the steam to the bitumen to frankly mobilize it. So it moves. You can just think of like wax or anything around your house when you light your candles, right? So there's dual functions. What the industry has found is that the reservoirs are more insulated than they thought. Like they contain the heat better. So they don't need to continue to put as much heat over time as they once thought. And so what they've been doing is they've been trying to find something else to put in the reservoir to maintain that other ingredient, which was pressure. And we've seen a lot of methane co-injection increase. They'll call it end of life injection. So rather than putting steam when the well starts declining, they'll put methane in, maintain the pressure, take the energy out, and go use it elsewhere. We've seen the SORs and SAGD fall in the last 2 years to kind of like record levels for the industry and hold. Our belief is that is the implications of those steam displacement technologies impacting them. We see a lot of variation in them in the industry as a whole. We see some people going in very early in life with high levels of methane. A lot of people just focusing on the back end of life and injecting on the back end. But the net effect is, if you do this in enough wells, you will get a marked improvement in the overall intensity. And so, yes, to your answer, we are seeing that. Next year, I think you'll also see Suncor's coke boiler replacement project come online. Petroleum coke being combusted at the Suncor base plant since its inception. It's roughly twice as carbon intensive as the use of natural gas. They're putting in some very large cogeneration units, and they will no longer be building that, combusting the petroleum coke, and it will be stacked and stored on site with a lot of the other petroleum coke that's generated. Most of it is stacked and stored as well. So we should see that impact next year as well from those sorts of improvements. There's lots of little things too, and that's really hard for us to put our fingers on. What we really look for in our modeling is we're looking at fuel use and how it's changing over time against output. And that doesn't always quantify exactly why did I suddenly get less fuel use, or why did I suddenly be able to produce more oil. The producers would have much better individual information. Our values, we can aggregate, talk about the sector.
Gotcha. Kevin, what about the emerging trend globally? I know it's at the very early stages, but this idea of pricing emissions intensity of oil and gas. You've had some conversations with folks in the industry about that outside of Canada. What's your take on it?
Well, all the indications we see is the market is interested in trying to incorporate carbon into business decisions. Certainly, that's what the financial community is trying to relay by tracking carbon intensity and trying to monitor that in their portfolio. And that's what they're being asked to report on as well to regulators, and companies are as well. And so we do carbon intensity estimates at asset level, like in the oil sands, to provide information. There's many reasons we do it. We also do commodity level carbon intensity. So we would take all the heavy oil in Western Canada and attribute it to a marketable stream, like a WCS, for example, and try to estimate the carbon intensity of that for the purpose of allowing people to have the information they need to frankly transact and incorporate in there. You're seeing regulatory developments internationally where carbon intensity is being positioned as a competitive metric. The carbon border adjustment mechanisms that Europe is contemplating to protect their industries from undercutting, from imports being brought into their country that don't face a price on carbon while they're trying to raise the price of carbon domestically, directly or indirectly. They don't, to kind of stop the risk of carbon leakage and protect their industry. The metrics, most likely that will emerge will most likely be carbon intensity. And carbon intensity over absolute emission for competitiveness is a really important point. There is a lot of focus on absolute emissions, and there's many reasons for it, and they're justified. But the problem with absolute emissions when we talk about competitiveness is it doesn't compensate for scale. So if I'm inherently large, I'm inherently bad on that metric. Whereas carbon intensity adjusts for scale, and it's really a measure of efficiency. Just to go back to your question, there are other things we've seen. We've seen cargoes go. We're professing their net zero cargoes because they've been offset. And certainly a lower carbon product being loaded would mean there's less offset cost associated with that as well. So there's lots of evidence to that interest in it. We don't see the market quite doing it yet, but we do see people asking questions, looking for assurance, looking for means to have those transactions occur.
Are we going to see the emergence of a market where that puts a premium on lower emissions intensity crude oil?
Yeah, what do we call it? We use in our pricing business, we think about carbon premiums for less carbon intensive commodities. Certainly, it's probably going to be more like a spectrum, just like we see in the pricing of commodities based on the physical attributes, such as the sulfur content or the density or the fractions. I'm thinking of oil, fractions in the barrel. Those all affect the value of that product or the price a refiner is willing to pay for that product. Certainly non-physical attributes could follow a similar principle, that there will be a spectrum of value based on the yield you get or what you do with the product, also related to the carbon intensity of the product as well.
Is this something that we're going to see emerge in the next few years, or is this more of a 5 to 10, maybe sometime in the 2030s timeline?
I don't know when it will emerge. I'm not the crystal ball person, but I think there is a lot of people with interest. There's a lot of regulators looking at this issue. There's regulators leaning in to provide the market assurance, because we talk about what does the market need? Well, one, you need to understand what it is. Like a physical attribute is pretty easy. You and I can go and take and boil a barrel and figure out what the assay looks like and agree on the properties, right? The carbon intensity is not quite as simple, right? You have to have data, you have to understand the data, and you have to provide a means to communicate assurance around that data. And so you see a lot of certifications going up around methane specifically because it's a very well-documented known unknown. But even from a carbon accounting point of view, there can be a tremendous amount of uncertainty as well. So you're also seeing governments lean in not only around understanding how to account, what do they look for, but also around how do I get better assurance, or how do I allow the market to transact? So I think it is something that is coming. I don't know when it's coming, Markham, but the path of travel is that there is a lot of interest in this. There is people sniffing around. There are some exchanges going on. There are conversations happening from financial institutions to market players.
Well, Kevin, as always, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
It's a pleasure to be here.